The following is a conversation between the Warren Bennis Leadership Initiative and Neal Novak. Neal Novak entered UC in the fall of 1969, pledging Beta Theta Pi his freshman year. He immediately became active in campus affairs and was invited to join Cincinnatus, Men of Metro, and Sigma Sigma. He was the second editor of the Interfraternity Council newspaper, The Greek Vine, that became important in his UC life. Early in his sophomore year, he got the first interview with then new president of the university, Dr. Warren Bennis. In 1971, Neal was invited to join the Bennis family as a student in residence, assisting them in running the household. In the spring of 1973, Neal became Dr. Bennis's personal driver for 16 months as the university was transitioning into a full state institution. Neal entered the College of Law in August of 1974 and worked part-time for the president through his graduation in 1977. As a practicing lawyer, Neal has worked with the American Bar Association and in private practice, as well as with several other outfits. Reading and interpreting insurance policies became Neal's passion and has led him to an international career from London to Tokyo. He is certified to practice law in the U.S. Virgin Islands and Hawaii. In 1993, Neal opened his own practice, Novak Law Offices, and has been operating them ever since. In late 2017, Neal reconnected with UC when he and a fellow student in residence, Dr. Joan Linhart Plunkett, formed an exploratory advisory group interested in developing a leadership institute at UC to honor and enhance the legacy of Warren Bennis. Today, the Bennis Leadership Initiative is very close to completing its preliminary work to become an operational leadership institute, thanks to Novak's leadership. Neal is the recipient of the 2022 Distinguished Service Award from the University of Cincinnati. So I am here with who I call the Bennis historian. Neal, is good to see you as always. We'll start with our first question. What was your involvement while you were at the University of Cincinnati?
My involvement with Warren and the Bennises, right? Yeah. Okay, sure.
And then in general as well. Like, what was life like for you there?
Okay. Yeah, let's start with that. I sort of came to UC thinking that the best education was probably found outside of the classroom, and so I wanted to get involved in as many things as I could get involved in. And I wasn't a guy who cut classes, but to me, the formal education part of it wasn't the challenge. The true matriculation and understanding, campus life and what was going on. And remember, I was a freshman in August of '69, and my freshman year ended in May of 1970 after 4 students were killed at Kent State. So it was a really different time to be going to college, and so I wanted to know more about what was going on out there, or as much about what was going on out there as I learned in the classroom. So I got involved in all kinds of campus activities in the Greek system and whatever I could do, and then when those things start, other things start. So you get asked to join groups like Metro and Cincinnatus, and then eventually Sigma Sigma in those types of groups. But that was sort of the consequences of getting involved in doing things, and it wasn't what you set out to do. It's just what happens when you do stuff. So in that context, that's how I wound up, meeting Warren, and that story is pretty well known about the day that he was moving in, and a friend of mine, a fraternity brother, and a good friend for a number of years afterwards, and somebody who actually worked for Warren too. Actually, I think Eric might have been Warren's first chief of staff, Eric Neal. And Eric had met Warren and called me up and said, "You should go meet him. He's a really nice guy." And I said, "Well, how am I going to do that?" "Well, he's moving in. Just go down the street and see him." So I did, and that was the story where I said, "I'm editor of the Greek Vine, which is an Interfraternity Council paper, and I'd like to interview you." And he said, "Yeah, sure. Help me get these boxes off that truck, and I'd be happy to talk with you." So I did that, and we sat down and talked for a couple of hours, and that was that. So we hit it off, and sometime within 6 months or so. So I was in my sophomore year, or it was the summer between freshman and sophomore, I think it was. I got a call saying, Dr. Bennis would like for you to consider moving into the residence. And I went, what? What's that about? And I knew that he always had students. The day I met him, there was a guy who they brought from Buffalo, and a woman, a young woman who was a ballerina, and he was a French artist or something. It was crazy. And but they had moved him down here, but they weren't there long. So there was a number of students who moved in and spent as long as they could, or as long as Warren and Clary wanted them, there. And so I lived at 750 Ludlow for probably 8 to 10 months, I would guess. And at that point, it was really a question of our job. So we'd get room and board. Our job was to help Clary and to help Warren for events around 750. Help Clary with the kids. So John, Will, and Kate were really tiny. I think Will was 5 or something, 6 when I met him, and Kate must have been 9 or 10, somewhere around there, maybe 11. And so that's what we did. And if they needed us for a specific event, we were there. If they didn't, we'd go away. So
that is crazy. I mean, that just must have been quite a surprising offer to get. Like, okay, you're going to move into the president's house and you're going to help, and room and board are covered. Like, I'm just imagining being a student getting that offer.
And I have to tell you, it was a little. Sometimes it was a little. It was difficult to date when you lived in.
Sure.
Because I recall on one occasion somebody said, "Where are we going?" I said, "Well, we're going back to the house." And he said, "Well, what house?" And I said, "The house I live in." And we're going up the drive at 750, and she goes, "What the?" And there were these words, and I said, I live with the president and his family, and she went, "I'm not going in
there." Neal, tell us about the house. Like, I feel like you just have a great memory for this. Tell us about 750. What was it like there?
The house was spectacular. I mean, Warren and Clary moved into Walter Langson, who was the prior president's house, and that was on Clifton. And I was only in that house once or twice. It was very different. It felt very, I don't know, the whole sense of it, the style and this scale and all of that didn't seem right. 750 was this big sort of sprawling space that had this massive sort of combined living room and dining room, and had a really nice little side parlor, I'll call it. And that's where Warren would have breakfast when he'd have the vice presidents over, and had a little garden view. And and 750 sits up on the top of that hill on Ludlow, and then upstairs. So the kitchen was off back to the left. One set of staircase from the second floor came down and sort of opened up into this sort of grand ballroom thing. And it was just a big place that really fit them. So you could have dinner, for 50 people there if you wanted to, or you could have an intimate little cocktail party for 10 or 12. So there was always something going on, and the kitchen was very busy. And Nina was the cook. She was very quiet, but she was very good. The kids were always running around. Clary was there, and we'll talk about Clary in a minute. But she was a really remarkable woman, and so there was always something going on at 750, and that's what really made it sort of enjoyable. It also is the reason why I knew when Warren asked me to work for him my senior year, and I started to work for him full time, that I knew I had to leave. So I started to work for him full time in March, I think, of 73, and I graduated in June of that year. So I had my spring quarter. I was working full time because I only had six credit hours or something that I needed to graduate. Okay. So I moved out. But for the year or so prior to that, that I was there, it was just constant, nonstop. And sometimes you knew what was going to happen, and sometimes you didn't, because people would just drop in, and Warren would be home, and I think I told the story before about Ellsberg, Daniel Ellsberg, after he released the Pentagon Papers, and 2 days later he's knocking on the door, and it was 11:30 or midnight or something like that, and he wanted to talk to Warren, and they did, and that was remarkable too. But there were business leaders, there were psychologists, there were some friends. But mostly academics and politicians who were coming through.
I think Maslow had stopped by the house. There's a video.
Yeah, Warren. Yeah, they were supposed to do. It was for PBS. They were supposed to do an hour interview. Warren was going to interview him for an hour, and at about 2.5 hours, they were still rolling, and it was mesmerizing. I mean, he was the guy who could go in and really challenge anybody at their level. And it made no difference whether it was a mathematician or an architect or whatever. He could talk to you on your level, and that was one of the things. I never really knew what it was like to be around a genius, but that was one. So he just had this enormous intellect and capacity to take in information, and more importantly, he could pretty quickly synthesize it and be able to use it on short notice. And he was always reading, always busy. I mean, that's why we always kidded him about getting in the car and driving himself, because it's like, Warren, when you get to the bottom of the driveway, you're going to get lost. So just don't go too far, because we're not going to be able to find you if you get lost. So
I love the story about their car getting stolen.
Yeah, when it just went down the driveway, and there were a couple of events with cars.
But he just assumed that somebody living in the house was taking it, right? Because there were so many people in and out all the time.
You would never know and say it got stolen. And there was the time too where Fleury had the vice presidents were there, and Ralph Bursick, who was the vice president of finance, had this big funky blue Buick, and Fleury had a little Fiat, and she came home, and she was backing up to park the car. There was no garage; it was just up the driveway, and there was space. There was a lot of space to park. But she wanted to back up, and she bumped Bursick's tail light and broke it. And all of a sudden, it was like, oh, and she pulled the car. And, all the adults are out there going, oh, what? How? This is really a bad thing. And Will, who was about 4 at the time, gets out of the car and sort of picks up all the pieces of the tail light and assembles it back onto the car and sort of puts it all back together. All we needed was some Elmer's glue, and it would have been perfect. But we're all going, oh gosh, what are we going to do? How are we going to fix this? And Will fixed it, and so that was that. But yeah, cars were a funny thing. We didn't like Warren being in it, but going back to the events, people all the time, every so often the chancellor, and it was a different system back then because we weren't state yet, but where they had all the chancellors, and George Steinbrenner, the former, now deceased Yankees owner, was on the board of chancellors, and he came to a meeting at 7:50.
Okay.
And Marvin Warner, Warner Communications, was his assistant, and these guys walked in, and you would have thought, and I looked, and Steinbrenner was just this big guy, and he's standing there, and Warner's brushing his Steinbrenner's suit, making sure it's clean and all that. It's like, who are these guys? And they came in, and Steinbrenner went rah, 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 and nobody said anything, and half an hour later he's gone, and then the meeting carried on. But it's just crazy things. The Rockefellers were nice people.
Steinbrenner, I just Googled him. I didn't know who he was. So American businessman, was this the same guy with the Yankees?
Yeah. The Yankees owner. Yeah,
Partner of
yeah,
the Yankees from
yeah,
73 until his death.
yeah,
Wow.
yeah. He was on the Chancellor's Board of I can't remember what it was called back then.
Okay.
But anyway, so they would meet at different universities through the year, and it happened to be UC, and Warren wanted to have it at 750. So I remember that meeting, and but my favorite folks were people like Barbara Jordan, who was the Texas congresswoman, and Sam Ervin, who was the South Carolina senator, who was part of the Watergate committee.
Okay.
And they were really interesting people and fascinating. And so, my job was to make sure they were entertained, taken care of, whatever, until Warren could come down and talk to them. So I sit and chat a little bit and say, but can I get you a glass of water? Do you need anything? And
Right.
But it was all good stuff. Jonas Salk and Saban, Dr. Saban and Salk. Saban was the guy who I liked a lot because he was the only guy. I used to grow a mustache. It was really bad, but I would grow a mustache and then I would shave it and I would grow it and I would shave it. And then one day I shaved my mustache off and nobody noticed. And it was like a day later, I went to pick up Saban from the airport and he said, "Didn't you have a mustache the last time I saw you?" And I said, "Thank you so much. You're the only one who noticed." But so that was Warren's life. I mean, those were the people, and it was pretty clear pretty early on that it was a remarkable trajectory for anybody to be, in that orbit, and to have those experiences with him. And so, Clary, I want to mention Clary.
Well, so real quick, Neal, before we get to Clary, you were doing events for the family and then at the same time driving, or did you do events and then started driving for him?
Yeah. When I lived there, there was always two students at least,
Okay.
and so when I lived there, it was really helping out around 750. I wasn't involved with Warren in the administration until I started full time. When I started full time for him and became the driver sort of gopher, he also gave me some other tasks. Like I was sort of the student liaison. So whenever there were meetings with the Thornburgs and folks like that, I was sort of involved, or some orientation stuff, anything within students. I was, the guy, and then I would follow up. I'd prepare letters for him or whatever. But it wasn't. I mean, it was. Calling myself the gopher or the driver was really predominantly what it was, and
Okay.
Going to pick up the laundry or getting him some yogurt or a cup of coffee, whatever he wanted. And but the good part, when we had the state transition, and I was driving him back and forth to Columbus, and sometimes that would be once a week, a couple times twice a week. And it was 104 miles, and I remember it was 104 miles from 750 to wherever we were meeting in Columbus. And I'd sit and wait, and and he'd say, "Meet me at X time at this place," and I would, and sometimes I sit and wait again. But that's when we had a lot of conversations. There were days when he'd want to talk, there were days when he didn't want to talk, and he would talk about everything. I mean, he would talk about work, writing he was doing, or discussion he had with somebody, or a problem he was thinking about, or anything. And so that was sort of how we really bonded, was a lot of hours in the car, just me and him going back and forth to Columbus. So I did still help out events at 750 when I was working for him. But then, so I went to law school. I worked full time for 16 months, 17 months, something like that. Graduated, went to law school. He didn't want me to go to law school. He thought I should have gone to Harvard or MIT or something, and gone into OD and sort of follow his footsteps. And but I didn't, and it was because of him. But that's another story. I go to law school, and he still was nice enough to create a position for me in the administration for summer jobs. So not coincidentally, I had 3 years of law school, and 3 more summers, working with him, and had room, board, and tuition paid for law school. So I graduated from law school and undergraduate with 0 debt, which was pretty remarkable. And then those were sort of the Aspen years when I started to go out with him, and I was sort of his Aspen guy because I knew everybody back in the office, and I'd help him get stuff back and forth, and FedExes, and talk to Eve and Arlene about whatever was going on. And he was a fellow at the Aspen Institute of Humanistic Studies, which was pretty fascinating too. And they had the summer music festival out there that Chloe really enjoyed. So so the summers with him when I was in law school were different from the time when I worked for him full time in between undergrad and law school, and then which is different still from the time when I lived there. So there was really sort of 3 segments over six years or so. I mean, I was around the Bennis's almost the whole time they were there, except for the first year.
So you were starting to tell us about Clary as well. What impact did Warren and Clary have on your life? Like, let's move that way.
Yeah. Okay. Well, they were an interesting couple, because she was his intellectual equal in a lot of ways, but in a different plane. She was much more of a free thinker, and she was very associative. And I always thought I had one conversation with Clary Bennis that started the day I met her and ended the day she passed. And the reason I said that is because we could be talking, and she'd say, "Well, who's so and so?" And I say, "Oh, well, Debbie. Yeah, that's a girl. Blah blah blah." And there's some couple of questions and some issues and all of that. And I'd go on and I'd go to class or whatever, and I wouldn't see her for a day or two, and she'd come downstairs and she'd say, "So then, what did Debbie say to you?" I said, "What?" Okay. But she had this knack for being able to pick up right where the last conversation left off, whether it was yesterday or 3 days ago or whatever. And it was really interesting because it just continued to evolve, and she was great. I think, yeah. So back to Clary, she was pretty remarkable, and she was really one of these people who could stay calm in the eye of the hurricane. And when things were bad or busy or hectic, she was unflappable, and had a really interesting approach to the kids. I mean, she was always involved with them, but she was very laissez-faire in a way, and it was like they'll learn, what's right and wrong and what's good and bad. And she certainly did insert herself in some of that narrative at times, but by and large, she let those kids, grow up and just absorb the influences that were around them. And again, it was a pretty remarkable group of people.
There was a quote that you had, I think it was hanging in your office for a long time, of hers about wanting her children to grow up.
Yes, to learn how to do, and to not be too old to be embarrassed to ask the questions, and how do you fix an electric cord and all of that. When she passed, she gave it to me. She had it, and then when they were moving to Aspen after he left, she gave it to me, and I kept it until she passed, and then I sent it to Kate. Okay. And I said, "You know what? This is from your mom to you. You guys should have this now." And she, Kate, it was a great quote. It's and it's actually in the guy who did it took it from the Horizon. You see Horizons. So that version of the magazine that they published, it was the special version at the end when Warren was leaving, sort of a recap of his career. And I have that somewhere. But it was.
I have it right in front of me.
Yeah, that's it. Okay.
We read it. Joni had me read it during our interview.
Oh, did she? Okay. Yeah. Well, Joni, I think Joni had more involvement with Clury
Okay.
than I did, because she, Joni being Joni, she was naturally, loved the kids and wanted to be around them, and I was, more with Warren, and the kids were great. It wasn't like we didn't spend some time together, but Joni was the one. I mean, she called herself the nanny, and I did not call myself the nanny, but. So anyway, so Clury and Warren together were really important as a team, and then life goes on, and things happen, so they had moved out to Aspen, and so that was my last kind of official contact with them, was in the fall of '77.
Okay.
I drove back to Cincinnati, and I sort of said goodbye, and then I didn't see. We stayed in touch, but I didn't see Warren for a while. So anyway, where's our next one? Oh, how does Warren influence your?
Well, let's
go ahead.
Real quick, Neal. You mentioned you've kind of taken us up through the fall of '77. Can you talk about the Going State campaign and just your perspective on that, from being involved with the family and being so involved with Warren, just that work that happened during that time?
Yeah, and that it's interesting because Tom Humes and Myron Allman were sort of the brains of the operation, and Bruce Hoppel was a little involved too, because Bruce actually had my job then as the gopher. So I was involved early on when the lobbying was happening, and that's why we were going back and forth to Columbus, because Warren was having meetings with all the representatives and senators and all of that stuff. And so he was laying the groundwork for the whole thing, and so that was early on, and but the strategy and the sort of the program, I guess, were really pretty much orchestrated by Hugo and Myron, and so my role in that piece of it was not significant, other than again being around Warren and supporting Warren. I wasn't working with them on a full-time basis on the day of the vote, and I know that was a big deal for everybody. Bruce was working with him then, and Bruce tells some funny stories about that. But so my role in that was early, and my role in that was getting him to the right place, and then listening to him talk about whoever he wanted to talk about, and why he thought this was going to work or why it wasn't going to work. But he wasn't 100% positive he was going to get the support he needed, but he did. And he worked hard at it, and it was important, because I don't think UC would have survived without that transition. Because the numbers were horrendous before that, and so it had to happen, or we wouldn't be here today.
Yeah, as you look back almost 40 years, more than 40 years ago now at this point, how do you think about his impact on the university?
I don't think that it would exist without what he did. And we're going to come down to some other things too.
Yeah.
Warren seldom doubted himself, but he did at times have doubts about how things were going at UC, how he was doing as the president, and it was seldom, but he occasionally sort of wondered out loud about some of that, and we can get to that in a bit. But yeah, I don't think. I mean, Dr. Pinto is terrific. He's a great president, and I saw the article that was in the paper a few weeks back, and I hope he does stay there for his entire career. Yeah, he's exactly what UC needs. Warren is what UC needed back then, and the difference is that if Dr. Pinto moves on, UC isn't going to collapse. If Warren didn't do what he did, they would have run out of money. It wouldn't have been able to function. So that's the difference. And I don't, most people don't understand that, because, how can a university fail? Well, they can. And it was a weird situation, because it was a dual city and state, and it just wasn't enough from either side in terms of the funding. And plus, there were a lot of politics involved in that were much more complicated than I could ever relate. But it was a tough time for UC, but most people didn't know that. And Warren did. He knew what the pressure was and the burden was, but he pulled it off.
When you mentioned at the beginning of the interview, this is on the heels of Vietnam or during Vietnam, a lot of the presidency. And I understand that was like a pretty tough time for college campuses, as referenced Kent State, across the country. So just given the challenges at home in Cincinnati, and then, the global context, it's interesting. I know that we've talked about this before, but Warren said that UC was the place where he learned to be the leader that he wrote about in his books. And what do you think he meant by that?
Yeah, I think he always, not always, but crucibles of leadership are a big part of his teaching, and UC was a big crucible for him. And so I think, my recollection of that time, in terms of him as a scholar, author, writer, as opposed to an administrator, was there were these times where the two would butt heads, and he would openly question himself about what direction he was going. Was this the right way to do it? I didn't think it was going to happen like this. And so, it was clearly, in the statehood thing was a big part of that. He was also involved with the Hebrew Union College as well too, and that didn't sit well with some people in Cincinnati. But he still supported him, and he was I think important to that group as well too. So where it came out, and the thing about where I learned to be the leader I wrote about, I think he wrote about the leadership qualities and issues beforehand, not as significantly as he did afterwards. I mean, On Becoming a Leader was the sort of the motherlode book of his, but all of that was in the making. I mean, he wrote The Leaning Ivory Tower, The Unconscious Conspiracy, and there was one other one I think he wrote when he was at UC, and they were interesting, but clearly he was thinking through a bigger, had a bigger plan in mind. So I think he was integrating a lot of what was going on at UC, and turning it into the good and the bad, turning it into the scholar that he became. I think it was in Still Surprised, which I love the way he talked about that most people don't deserve an autobiography. So this is a memoir, and the thing about it is you tell your story, and you tell your story the way you want to tell your story. And the quote from his friend at SUNY Buffalo, who I can't remember his name, but he said, Warren, your story is your story. It's not your life. And that's what makes Still Surprised a really interesting read. But he was asked the question when he was speaking somewhere, do you love being president of the University of Cincinnati? And he went, and he had to admit to himself that he didn't love it, and because it really caused him a lot of conflict in his decision making and the impact of it, and was he doing the right thing? And it was a struggle. It was a struggle for him, and he would talk about it sometimes. Sometimes he wouldn't. Sometimes he would. He'd stay up in his room until 2 or 3 a.m. and drink coffee and pound away at the typewriter, and he had this big desk with pendaflexes, all these drawers with pendaflexes. And so he was always cutting stuff out or sent, notes on papers, newspapers, magazines, whatever. So giving them to even Arlene. It's like, save this, do this, copy this, all of that. So you'd always get a little, photocopy of something, and he'll say it'll be 4 or 5 initials at the top, and in his handwriting, send to blah 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 blah, and there'd be a tick next to your initials, and that so there's your copy.
The cool thing, Neal, I don't know if I ever told you this, but when you sent me to USC to go through his papers in the archives, I saw some of that.
Yeah.
In those papers, just the cutouts and everything.
Yeah. He would do that, and he would be asked to do book reviews and comment on articles, and he wrote a lot. He wrote a ton of stuff for the Harvard Business Review back then, and so he could do what I'll call essays, but short articles. He was constantly writing. He never stopped being an academician while he was working. You see, as president, he just had to sort of do his day job, and then he wouldn't do at night what he liked to do. And that, ultimately, I think it took a toll on his health, and I think it was 79 he had the heart attack. But
so how? Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say he was a 20-hour-a-day guy.
Okay. So how did he influence how you think about leadership? I mean, I know that you just mentioned Still Surprised. I mean, so you got to know him as a person, and then I know that you've read him and studied some of his work. So how would you describe what he wrote about, and then how has he influenced how you think about leadership?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, I'm not sure the best way to say is for as brilliant as he was and as insightful as he was, he always wanted collaboration. So that's going to the point in terms of leadership style and how he influenced me. And it's like the bigger the question, the more difficult the question, the more input you needed to get he would call it the best and the brightest. So he did blue ribbon committees, and he would always form these panels, and they would be made up of people who you might not ever think about putting together in the same room, but for this particular task, they were the best. So he would know what the skill sets were of the individuals, what they could bring to the collaboration, how they would mesh. What's the issue? What do we have to decide? And and set out. And he would listen to people. So one of the best characteristics of him was his ability to listen, make you feel important, and then and answer questions or ask questions. So the listening piece of it was really what made him the interviewer that he was. I mean, as good of an interview as he would give, he was better at interviewing people because he could take anybody on their level on any topic, and that was really impressive to me as a young kid, and how he would go about making decisions. So the collaboration style. I mean, even today in cases that I work on, if there's important questions, I don't dictate what the answer is. I mean, I do my research, I do whatever, but I talk to, I'm fortunate to have some good lawyers with me, and we'll talk through some tough issues and sort of together come up with the answer. Sometimes it's not exactly what I would have done on my own, but it's the right answer. And that's what I learned from Warren was you don't always know. You do need input. You do need to talk to people. You think you know, and that's good if you think you know. Don't abandon yourself, but check it out. Verify. And so I think that was the biggest thing I learned from him was talk to people, listen to what they say, and then make your decision. And he was always, I mean, when I knew him, that's how he was, and I think that's what he sort of carried through in his writings later on.
What do you what does his legacy mean today? You've been involved in it might be fun for folks to hear about some of the legacy building work that you've been involved with.
Wait, that I've been involved with?
Yeah, well, just how you got involved, Neal, with starting to bring the legacy back to campus to UC.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yes, that was okay. Um, so Warren, when Warren left in '77, um, yeah, and he tells the story, and I'm still surprised. But I don't know. I don't know if it hadn't have developed the way it did. Um, I don't know if he would have left then. But I think he was. I think he was done, and was close to making the decision anyway. And so that was my sense of things, because he'd worked so hard. He accomplished the task of the statehood thing. Interesting. Sam Ervin and Watergate and all that. I worked for Leon Jaworski when I moved to Chicago. My first job was with the American Bar Association, and Leon Jaworski was the Watergate prosecutor. And we were in Aspen. I was in Aspen with Warren on the day that the Supreme Court voted 8-0 on executive privilege, which was the beginning of the end for Nixon. And that day, Warren had lunch plans with this guy and his wife, and it was Warren and Chloe, this couple. And the guy comes in and he says, "Warren, I gotta use your phone." And the wife goes, with Chloe, and I was the gopher, so sure. Would you like a glass of wine? Okay, so 2 bottles of wine later, this guy's still on the phone, and Warren's working in the study, and he says, "I'm really sorry, we have to go." So the guy was Caspar Weinberger, who was Nixon's Secretary of Defense, and it was the day that the Supreme Court voted 8-0 against Nixon. And that night we went over to the Institute, and sort of Warren and Bill Moyers and some people started to talk about democracy and the Constitution, peaceful transfer of power, and it was 3 weeks later I was supposed to be starting law school, and so it was sort of an interesting place to be. But
you said a whole crowd walked over, like they just walked over there, right? And then it ended up being a whole gap.
Yeah, it was reminiscent of the 60s, early 70s, where you could have 5 students with a bullhorn, and all of a sudden there'd be 1,000 people around, and it would just be these spontaneous events. And then in later years they called them flash mobs, I guess, or something like that. But so anyway, that's what happened the day Nixon resigned. So when Warren left, he was needed a break. Was out in Aspen. I was not happy with how things happened with his successor, and I won't go into names, but Warren had a great staff, and it pretty much got dismantled, and people were let go, and it was not pretty. So it really alienated me from the university, and I was not a supporter. I moved to Chicago not too much after that in '80, and I just wasn't involved in the university. And, people would call and want to stop by, and I would see people at the foundation. And I've talked with Peter about this too. The foundation had the issue, and Bill Mulvihill will be another one to tell you. Sort of a revolving door. Mulvihill is remarkable because of his longevity and his ability to navigate through all that stuff. And he probably knows the university from the ground up better than anybody living today. But so I was not a fan, and then we got the letter. Joni called me up. I got this letter from USC after Warren passed. It might have been 2016, early 2017, somewhere around there, saying, "Would you contribute to a chair for Warren Bennis?" And I all of us had communicated with him there, and we knew Marie, and she was great, and she was took care of him, and was very loyal and all of that. And protected him from all kinds of things. But she had everybody's information, and so USC just reached out to everybody Warren knew, and Joni said, I don't want to give money to USC. Why isn't Cincinnati doing something? I said, I don't. Let's find out. So I called Tom Humes and said, Tom, is the university doing anything for Warren? And he said, I don't think so, but why don't you guys do something? And so Joni, he sort of talked with Joni about it and said, why don't you chair this group and see if you can do it? And Joni said, I'm not doing it unless Neal does it. And so the two of us sort of committed together to do that. And it gave me a reason to come back to UC, and it gave me a reason to reconnect to UC and to see how much it had developed and advanced and became sort of the word I'm looking for. I don't want to say global institution, but certainly enhanced in a significant way. Its vision, its approach, its style, and all of that. And I don't even recall who the presidents were before Dr. Pinto came on. I know the ones right after Warren. I wasn't around. Nancy was in for years. I wasn't around for, and of course, I did go. She had the big controversy where she fired Bob Huggins as the coach, and then it was he's here for a short time. Greg Smith, the guy who was an Ohio State guy, I think. I met him at a reception up here in Chicago, and I didn't know what to say to him, and I said, "Well, nice to meet you." I said, "Are you going to bring Huggins back?" And he said, "Well, last time I looked, he had a job." And I went, "Okay, well, fair enough. You still could give him a call." But so I didn't have a reason to come back home until Warren, who sort of made my years there really, really unique and different. Reached out indirectly and gave me that purpose. And,
brought you back home.
Brought me back home, yeah. So that's how it happened, and I thank Joni for that, and I thank Tom Humes for saying, I got too much to do. I don't want. We can't do this too. You guys go do this. And Dick and Myron and Bill Mulvihill's been invaluable, as you know, and then folks like Lauren and Mary Ann comes along, and it's really I didn't know how it was going to happen, and I didn't know where it was really going to go, but I felt like it was the right thing to do, because as I said from day one, hey, this is the only place where he actually lived and roved as a leader, of a significant institution. I mean, he was provost, I think, at Buffalo, but he wasn't president anywhere else. And so if you're going to talk about the home of the father of leadership, it ought to be at the institution where he was the leader. So it makes sense that it's UC. We've always talked about the interdisciplinary and sort of wide-reaching vision of the eventual institute, the initiative as it is now. To think about Harvard and USC and places that were important to him, USC in particular. And so I think that will all happen in time. That's down the road. We've got to get to step one here, but I can see it now, and I couldn't see it when we started out. We didn't know. We didn't know exactly what we wanted to do, how we wanted to do it. We knew we wanted to have input from Kate and Will, and John had some conflicts and wasn't able to be involved, but he was pretty involved through Kate and Will, and with the people that we were talking to, and the collective experience in that room, both from inside and outside the university, it was a really good advisory board that developed some ideas, and then we put together sort of the mission statement, vision statement, whatever we want to call it, and that's what we all drafted. I guess I had the lead on that, but and then we sort of refined it, and Tom took it to Dr. Pinto, and hi, Mary Ann Lewis, nice to meet you, and so that was sort of how it went.
I know you had an opportunity this past year to speak to the Breakfast with Bennis students,
Yes.
and I wish I was able to be on that call, but I would imagine for you, Neal, decades later to be coming back and telling the story of, a mentor and friend of yours, somebody that held a significant, right, role in your life in Warren and Clary, as you mentioned. But I would imagine just the opportunity to speak to some students who didn't know who he was before, or maybe had some idea of who he was before you got to share some of your stories with them. But what was that like, and why is it important, to build on this legacy?
And Donna, I didn't mention Donna earlier.
Yeah.
She's been really helpful too, because of when we put the group together, the advisory board. We knew we needed some faculty, and we got some names, and Donna was the one of the three faculty members. I think we had three, who always was willing to say, "I'll do it. I'll do it. I'll do this. I'll do this task. I'll do this." And then you came along, and you were doing the experience thing, and so Kate's big concern was, wait, how's this going to work with the experience? I like the experiences. It's gonna blend. It's all gonna blend. It's gonna be all part of the same thing. I mean, that's the way I saw it. And going sort of going full cycle. And when Donna asked me to talk to the group, I thought, what a great idea, because I like to tell stories, and so they're going to have to listen because it's a class, so they're going to be there. So I like to tell stories, and also I'm telling stories about a guy who was really important to me. And when I look back, I'm going to college and law school. You can't, the kind of experiences that I had because of him.
Yeah.
No, 18, 19, 20-year-old kid from Cincinnati or Cleveland or Columbus or anywhere, is going to have that type of a college experience, unless they had the opportunity that I had, that I sort of fell into, because my idea, as I said at the outset, was I want to know more about what's going on out here than I do in the classroom, and that's sort of what led me to Warren. And Warren also had a really good eye for picking out people who had different skills. And I was always curious, and so I'd always ask questions, and you got to be curious.
Well, I love that story that you told about the walking on campus, and what's the difference between you can finish it. What's the difference between a Ivy League school student and a public school student?
Yeah. That was the spring. We did two springs. Because he loved the classroom so much. He always liked to go and talk to students. He really did. He just lit up when he was around students, and sometimes you could see his irritation in meetings with the vice president sometimes. But the students, he had a lot of time. So he wanted to go around. We'd go to different classrooms, and the professor would know that we would be coming, but the class wouldn't know. And it was architecture. We went to a group of graduate math students, and just 4 or 5 different places. And we walked around campus and went to these courses. That was interesting. Engineering, went to engineering too. That's where I really saw him in a matter of minutes change from being an architect to being an engineer to to being a mathematician. And he walks in and he goes, I'm the president, and what are you guys studying today? And they'd say it, and he'd go, oh, well, what about the theorem of da da da, and he'd be off and running. And it was amazing. And that's when we were walking between classes, and I said, so how do you do that? What's the difference between the Harvard students and the Ivy League and the UC student? And that's when he said, it's not the pedigree of the school that distinguishes those students. It's the rage to learn. And you go,
yeah,
it's still powerful to me today, and that's one of the things that causes me to want to see this through, because of I guess I always wanted to learn, but Warren made me realize why it was important to want to learn. And it's not just that knowledge is power. It's just when you understand how the world functions, it makes it a better place or a worse place. It could make it worse. But that's why, coming back to the leadership idea and towards the end, Warren was interested in trying to advance public sector leadership. That has a lot of challenges, and it's unfortunate that it does. But if you're gonna raise money for something, public sector leadership is not where people are willing to write checks for. But you got to get there. And so I think the Bennis Leadership Institute will get there, because that's where Warren wanted to go, and Warren is still the reason why we're doing all this. So I think that vision is something that's going to carry through to the future folks who are going to be running that institute and who understand him. And as long as Kate and Will are around and they have input, it'll get done. So yeah, that's one of my best stories about Warren. That was a life changer.
It's I certainly didn't have the chance to meet Warren. I was about a year short, but I can definitely feel his spirit and presence in you and the stories that you share, Neal. So we're lucky to have the University of Cincinnati is lucky to have you in its blue ribbon committee as it works to build this institute.
So I welcome the opportunity when it presented itself, and I'm really happy. I'm really happy that it's gone to where it's gone. I think, did we make every right move? No, we made a couple of wrong moves and probably prolonged this a couple of months, 6 months, 8 months. But I think where we are today, where this initiative is today, it just again, it's not me and Joni. It's everybody who did the work. But why did we all do the work? We did it for Warren. So I think about his teaching and the students he had contact with, and he had a big impact on their lives in that way. To me, he was just a guy every day that I was with for all of my undergraduate and really postgraduate training, and couldn't have had a better mentor or resource anywhere than Warren. So I'm thankful for that, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to be able to come back and help make this happen.